Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
My guest is historian and author John Ragosta. His books include Religious Freedom, Jefferson's Legacy, America's Creed, and The Wellspring of Liberty. John's latest book is Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution. It's good to see you, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Coy. Always a pleasure.
How are things? What's the latest?
Oh, things are going well. I've been teaching down at Randolph this year, but also working on my writing and publishing, and glad to see this book came out in August.
Now, this new biography of Patrick Henry that you've written is part of the a series with Routledge Press, right?
Right. They're doing historical Americans. You know, there were all these series done 100 years ago about famous Americans, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Routledge is updating that and including people we might not think of, Arlo Guthrie, Thurgood Marshall, but they also want to do the Founding Fathers. And so I was asked to do Patrick Henry and had the pleasure of putting this together.
You know where I'd like to start? What did you learn? We'll start at the beginning, who he was, and the Revolution, and the Constitution, and the famous speech, and why Jefferson hated him, and all the good intrigue from the day. But I'm curious what you walked away with that really struck a chord with you, like, wow, that was really interesting to you as the author.
Right, and I think one of the most important things that I learned and didn't really appreciate when I started out doing this is how important Henry was to the revolutionary moment. I mean, everybody has heard about his give me liberty or give me death speech. In fact, that's generally the only thing that people recall about Patrick Henry.
Exactly.
You know, he had this famous speech, and it was great, and he said, give me liberty, give me death. But the interesting thing is when you study Henry, he was really essential for getting the revolution going. Thomas Jefferson, who ends up hating Patrick Henry, I mean, really despising Patrick Henry, even Jefferson says that, you know, Henry got the first impulse to the ball of revolution. But then after the revolution, Henry becomes the great anti-federalist and opposes the Constitution. And a lot of what we think of as the anti-federalists and the politics of the anti-federalists that really become the Democratic Republican Party, interested in the small folks, you know, democracy, getting people involved. Patrick Henry really was at the beginning of that. And so I think his
one of the first great populists.
Absolutely. I mean, and in fact, Jefferson and Madison, we always think of Jefferson and Madison and the Democratic Republican Party and the Revolution of 1800. In many ways, they're really taking over a movement that Henry was much more important at starting. And so I think that his role, which we tend to undervalue because all we remember is give me liberty or give me death, the importance of his role. And then I would match with that, the other interesting thing was he's not power hungry. He at the end, in the 1790s, he's offered positions as Supreme Court Justice, ambassador to France, ambassador to Spain, senator, and he always says, no, I'm taking care of my family, and really goes on. And, you know, a lot of the other founders, as important as they were, Jefferson really cared about, you know, having office, and John Adams and Benjamin Franklin even really cared about their legacy. Henry was really able to push this aside much more than many of the other founding fathers.
And often in that era, it was appropriate for a great leader to say, no, I don't want office, to defer, to sort of put on a bit of a show. As Jefferson, you can read it in his letters, I'm not meant for politics. I'm a farmer. I'm a simple man. BS. He wanted to be president. Huge ego. But
right.
For Henry, it looked like it was true. He really didn't want to.
Right. I mean, as you say, 18th century, you have to say, no, I'm only interested in the public good. And who would have ever thought someone would elect Thomas Jefferson president as he's campaigning for 12 years for the presidency? But, you know, Henry really does have this idea that what we fought the revolution for was this idea of being at home under your vine and fig tree. And he would use a biblical reference. The idea is people being able to live with their families, live in peace, have a good life. And he really tried to live that to some extent more. And to his credit, I mean, it's very hard when you reach the pinnacle of power. He was governor of Virginia 5 times. He was elected a 6th time, and he said, no, I don't want to be governor again. I want to take care of my family.
Wow. I did not know he was governor that many times. I knew he was the first governor.
He's the first governor.
So he was reelected. And one thing, too, just to sort of as we're setting the stage here for exploring the life of Patrick Henry and the legacy, one thing, too, that most Americans may not really appreciate is the extent to which he was very much of a very devout man, very much of a Christian, did not necessarily believe in the separation of church and state because to him a faith, a life of faith was absolutely critical to being a good citizen in a democracy.
Right.
And, you know, was he like one of the, what we might think of today as a Christian conservative or a populist conservative?
I'm not sure I'd say a Christian conservative, although you're certainly right. He's a very devout man. He's religious from very early on. But 2 things in that regard. The one is he joins Jefferson and Madison in fighting the establishment. He thought it's wrong that we have an established church in Virginia. The Episcopal Church gets tax revenue and so on. And he thought that was wrong. But then he falls out with Jefferson and Madison over separation of church and state because he did not agree with that. And he lost the battle over separation of church and state in 1784 to 86, when in 1786 the statute for establishing religious freedom is adopted. But the other thing, though, that there have been historians recently that try to explain Henry entirely based on his religion. And one of the problems with, I think that's a little misleading as well. He's very devout, but he's also very much a political thinker. He's very much a rationalist in his own way. And one of the things that was said when Henry falls out with Jefferson in 1799 over the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, where Jefferson and Madison are attacking the Alien and Sedition Acts and really threatening the government, and Henry falls out with them. And Jeffersonians tried to explain that away by saying, oh, you know, Henry's senile. He's fallen into an overly religious guy who just can't think straight anymore. And it was completely absurd. I mean, if you read Henry's letters, if you listen to his speeches, he was not senile at all, nor was he just completely, he actually sort of jokes. He says, people will think I was a monk. And he means that as a joke. He says, I'm not that religious. but you know, as compared to, say, Jefferson or even George Washington, Henry, yes, he's very devout and much more traditionally. I mean, he's Episcopalian.
Yeah. So with all of that in mind, help us understand sort of the quick sketch of who Patrick Henry was before the speech, before he became this young man, because that's important. Again, a lot of people don't know. These were young men who pushed for revolution in Virginia, and everybody was watching Virginia to see what Virginia would do. Biggest state, most populous state. Most of the big thinkers of the colonies lived in Virginia, were educated there, and but the revolution didn't come from the old guys who were making money off big tobacco plantations in the East. It came from those young guys on the frontier, the Madison, Jefferson, and Patrick Henry.
And Henry, very much the leader of the young bucks. And he's older than Jefferson. And Jefferson initially looks up to Henry as the leader of what we would call the young bucks, these young Turks, whatever term you want to use, these guys who came in and were shaking things up. Where does that come from? He, sometimes people would say Henry was born poor and he made his way, this great success. That's not really true. I mean, his family, today we would say upper middle class. He was not born poor. He was raised on a plantation with enslaved people. But he doesn't have the kind of money that a Jefferson or a Washington or a Madison or a Randolph would have had. And so early on in life, his father is trying to set him up for a job and gets him a job as a clerk. He's a clerk in a store, and he and his older brother, William, have a small country store. He also then, the country store fails, and he goes to work in his father-in-law's tavern. And Jefferson later, again, sort of attacks him and insults him and says he was a bartender for a period of time, which, yeah, he was helping in his father-in-law's tavern as his father-in-law was having some financial problems. But I think that's important, that Henry was much closer with the real people than simply sitting around a plantation. And he saw
Yeah,
these
when did
small
Jefferson
farmers.
and Madison ever work in a tavern?
Right, or a small country store, and you know he actually owned 2 stores over time, and both of them failed. Well, they failed because people didn't have money to pay their bills, and Henry was sympathetic. These small farmers would come in, their wives would come in and say, you know, I need salt, but I can't pay you right now. I'll pay you when the crop comes in, and Henry gave too much credit, and both of his stores ended up going out of business. He ultimately succeeds as a lawyer. He becomes the most successful lawyer in Virginia. But his success as a lawyer and as a politician, I think, really owe a lot to the fact that he really understood the common man in a real personal way, much better than almost any of the other founders. Benjamin Franklin may come to mind, because Franklin also comes from a background where he was a tradesman, he was a printer, he was working with these people, maybe Samuel Adams, but Henry really was part of that common revolution.
And early on, the kind of guys who truly understood the common man, they weren't in the House of Burgesses. They're not in those colonial state legislatures. And then even then, in the late 1770s, 1780s, they're not in the new state legislatures. It's still an elite club.
Right, and it expands over time. I mean, Henry becomes a member of the House of Burgesses in 1765. So, again, very early for that group. And that's why he's looked upon. Some people actually were quoted later when the first Continental Congress starts in 1774 that Henry will go and teach the bigwigs, and that's the term they use. He'll teach the bigwigs a lesson about the common man. So he comes from that kind of a background, not poor. And again, that was something people said sort of as an insult. But he understood folks a lot better. And then he used that as a lawyer. He was so successful. I mean, he's the most successful trial lawyer in Virginia.
Is that where he develops the oratorical skills that gave him the legacy and the fame in America?
Absolutely. His skill with a jury is unmatched by anybody. Even Jefferson admits that, he would say that at one point he says that Patrick Henry spoke as Homer wrote. Okay, now if you're Thomas Jefferson, this is a compliment.
It is indeed, yeah.
He spoke as Homer wrote. He also does learn that, back to your religious point, he's Episcopalian. His mother is Presbyterian. And when he's a child, takes him to see Samuel Davies, who's the first licensed Presbyterian minister in Virginia. He's an evangelical, very active, very enthusiastic sermons. So Henry says, I learned by listening to Samuel Davies, this evangelical Presbyterian minister, but then he also learns doing jury trials. And his great break comes in the Parsons cause when he has a chance to defend the local vestry against what he views as the tyranny of the king and the established church.
So, and that's the thing that really puts him on the map initially, right, is this case. Can you give us a quick sketch of what this was about?
Right.
Because it's really what made Patrick Henry famous for the first time in Virginia.
It's absolutely what makes him famous. And some people say it really started the revolution. That in Virginia, Episcopal ministers are paid with a tax. Everybody pays the Episcopal minister, and they're paid in tobacco because that's what was used as money at the time. But what would happen is if you'd have a bad tobacco crop, tobacco prices would skyrocket. So suddenly the minister is getting maybe 3 times the amount of money that was intended. If there's a huge tobacco crop and prices drop, the minister is getting half the money.
So the minister is praying for bad weather so he can...
Right, so he can make money.
Yeah.
But so there was very bad tobacco crop one year, and the legislature passes a law. The House of Burgesses says, look, if you can't pay tobacco, you can pay 2 cents per pound of tobacco. The minister was supposed to get 16,000 pounds of tobacco, 2 cents a pound, which was the standard price, although tobacco was selling for 6 cents a pound at the time. And this gets taken to England, and it's declared by the Privy Council a null and void law because the king had not approved it. The law is bad. You have to pay the ministers. So the case was lost, and the lawyer who was representing the vestry, the people who had to pay the minister, resigned because he said the case is lost. The king and the Privy Council have declared this law is null and void. We have to pay. And they hired Patrick Henry at the last minute. And Patrick Henry comes in and launches into
and he's young, right? I mean, he's still in his 20s, right?
He's in his 20s.
Yeah.
25. He launches 25, 26, but he launches into an attack on the king. And people were astounded. People were saying, treason. And he says, look, the king is the king, but he owes the people an obligation. And when the king is no longer doing what's good for the people, but starts being a tyrant, and that's when people are yelling treason, then we shouldn't follow the king. And
which wasn't a crazy argument to make. I mean, you can go back to the 17th century, the English Bill of Rights in the 1680s, and it's all there that the king is supposed to follow the people and do what's best for all the people.
Right. As I point out in the book, he's really making an argument based on John Locke's theory of compact government from the 1680s. But you can't say that to a jury. He's not going to say, well, John Locke. I mean, that would be something Jefferson would say.
Right.
But he's just, the king is a tyrant when he's not concerned about his people. And then he turns on the ministers. And he says, and what are these ministers doing? This law was passed because the people are hurting. They can't pay their taxes. It's a reasonable law, and these ministers are a bunch of harpies. He uses that term. He said there's a bunch of rapacious harpies who are trying to screw their congregants for money. And whatever happened to the mild religion of Jesus Christ, they're trying to get money. They would take and he says, they would take the last blanket from the laying-in woman. There's a woman who's sick with pregnancy.
He really went after them.
He really goes after them. And so the
money-hungry clergy.
Money-hungry clergy, the king is ignoring the people. The jury goes out. By the way, his father is the chief magistrate. His father is sitting there listening to this. But the magistrates have already ruled that the law is no good. The king says the law is no good. Well, the jury goes out, and they come back, and they side with the priest, because they have to, because the law is no good. But they say 1 penny in damages. And of course, he was owed hundreds and hundreds of pounds, but 1 penny in damages.
Wow.
Well, people, carry Henry out on their shoulders. They literally pick him up, Hanover Courthouse, carry him out on his shoulders, and this launches his career. But it's really indicative of where Henry was coming from, that this law, okay, the law is null and void as a matter of British law, because it did not get the approval of the king the way it was supposed to. But it was a good law for people, just common folks who were trying to pay their taxes and couldn't afford to pay their taxes because tobacco was, unavailable. It was 3 times the normal price. And the people loved Henry from that moment on. He gets a lot of publicity. He is an advocate for the common man.
And he wasn't making the argument that the taxpayers shouldn't support the church at all. He was just saying, let's make it reasonable so they can afford it.
Right, absolutely. He's a supporter of the church at that point, but he says this law is a reasonable law. And that's how he gets elected to the House of Burgesses, that he is going to be an advocate for the people, even against the king and the clergy, if necessary, who are the power structure of 18th century Virginia.
And when is this?
1763.
Wow.
So this is early
So
on.
early.
Right. And so then when he gets to the legislature is just when the Stamp Act is breaking out. And who better than Patrick Henry to take up the cause? And then he, becomes a patriot known throughout the colonies and throughout in London. I mean, people are writing back to London saying there's this young guy, Patrick Henry, and he's making trouble. So they know about him in London very early on.
My guest is John Ragosta. The new book is Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution. What do we know about him personally? Was he tall? Was he short? What did he look like? What did he sound like?
Well, one of the problems is we don't have the papers of Patrick Henry like we have for a number of the other founders. Letters, a lot of them got burned because he didn't want them left. But we do know he's apparently fairly thin man, fairly tall. Some people say 6 feet. Eyes as blue as a summer sky, one of his granddaughters says, although others say his eyes are gray. So reddish hair, tall man, but thin and angular in many respects. We also know personally he marries very young, which causes some problem with both his family and his in-laws. He's 18. He falls in love with a 16-year-old Sarah Shelton. They get married. People are concerned about it. And again, this is when he's not yet a lawyer. He's a clerk. His store is failing. He has 6 children with Sarah, and she goes insane, which was a terrible, terrible tragedy for Patrick Henry. She's basically in a straitjacket in the basement of the house because there's nothing else you do in the 18th century.
And she was young, possibly schizophrenic?
The general view is probably severe postpartum. She'd had 6 children, one after the other. And but she goes insane and dies. He then marries his child bride. He marries a woman who's 20 years younger than he is and has another 11 children. So he has 17 children.
My goodness.
And he's very concerned about his family. So one of the things, he gets accused of making money as a lawyer, and that he would take a fee for, he would take these very large fees. But he says very early on, I don't want my children to have to struggle the way I did. And he's going to see to it that every one of his sons is going to have a plantation, and every one of his daughters. Now, the daughters, in 18th century wouldn't necessarily get a lot, but he wanted to make sure they had money as well. He wouldn't give them a farm. He said, their husbands would take care of that, but he made sure his daughters were provided for also. So he's an interesting fellow. And as I said, 17 children. He has thousands of descendants.
So that speech, really quickly, it was over about the Stamp Act, right? At St. John's Church.
Okay, that's later. That's 1775.
Okay.
1775, the Liberty or Death speech. We're not sure if we're going to war yet. This is before Lexington and Concord. Okay. We know that the British have imposed taxes. We know the Boston Tea Party. We know the British have retaliated against Massachusetts. They've closed the port of Boston.
And let's just take a moment for those who don't know, because it's not talked about enough. The reason the British are imposing these taxes on the colonies is not just to willy-nilly punish their countrymen, but they have a deplenished treasury. They have entered the empire game. I mean, Americans should understand this. England went broke, fighting wars all over the world. They're in India. They're in the Mediterranean. They're fighting all over the globe in the what was the World War of the 18th century, the 7 Years' War. They won, but at what cost? I mean, so many men died all over the world. They have no money. So they're like, hey, America, we won you the peace in America, but you need to pay for it now. You need to pony up because we're broke.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, that's when the French are thrown out of Canada. That's when the frontiers, to some extent, become safer because the Indians are not being supplied with weapons by the French. Now, the Indians are still very successful at defending their own lands. So the British thought it was very reasonable to expect the Americans to pay for some of this. And, of course, this is the no taxation without representation. Henry's view, and Jefferson's and Washington would be, look, we're members of the empire, but we have no representation. You can't force us unless we're going to have our representatives there. And that's going to become very important for Henry throughout his life, that government has a legitimate right to expect its people to pay taxes, to expect its people to comply with reasonable laws, if people have the right to participate in government. And so from Henry's perspective... And
if government truly is the voice of the people and not the voice of just the elite or just the church.
Right. Yeah. So, Coy, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not unreasonable for Britain perhaps to want some tax dollars from America, but from Henry's perspective, you're not our government because we're not represented and you're not the voice of the real people.
Which was absolutely true, and there were huge swaths of England at the time that weren't even represented in Parliament.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't just a problem in America.
Yeah, I mean, the system, Henry and Jefferson and Madison are going to be responsible for the democratization of the country where more and more people are going to be able to vote. I mean, in Virginia, you had to be a white, male, Episcopal landowner to vote. Okay, that's not a huge share of the population.
Yeah, it was an exclusive club.
It's fairly exclusive. But, by 1775, when the Liberty or Death speech is made, we have had the First Continental Congress. We've entered a boycott against the British, so they've imposed these taxes. You get the Boston Tea Party. They retaliate against Massachusetts. Continental Congress says, we'll retaliate with a boycott. But nobody knows what's going to happen. Certainly very few people are talking about independence, and people are very uncomfortable with talking about war. There's no war yet. There's no Lexington and Concord.
And arguably a vast majority of Americans wanted to do everything they could to avoid war.
Yeah, people do not want war. And the speech comes up because Henry stands up and makes a motion that we, Virginia, prepare our defense, that we need to prepare for war because I can see what's coming. And it's going to be, England's not going to back down. Britain won't back down. We're going to have to fight. And he says, they were part of the speech, we must fight. We must fight. So it's March 23rd, 1775. It's, 3 to 4 weeks before Lexington and Concord. And he's defending the idea that we need to arm ourselves against Britain. And it's a wonderful speech. The next gale from the north will bring the sound of resounding clashing arms coming from Massachusetts, which of course is prophetic. He says, why does England send an army and a navy? If they want to treat us like good citizens, they don't send an army and a navy. And of course, the men cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. And then into the famous language, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And it's overly dramatic. We would look at it today if we could put it on TV and watch what Patrick Henry said and did, we'd almost laugh, because he was going through these gyrations. He bowed down when he said, I know not what course others may take, and he's bowed down like he's a slave in chains, and he rises up and he takes an ivory letter opener and he says, give me liberty or give me death, and he plunges the letter opener under his arm and falls over like he's dead. We would laugh. But the 18th century, there's no TV, there's no internet, there's no radio. This was really high drama. And people are listening. The church is packed. It's at St. John's Church in Richmond. The church is packed. People are listening at the windows. When he's done, there's just silence. People are absolutely spellbound. One man is listening at a window, becomes a American Revolutionary War officer, and gets down from the window, having listened to the speech, and turns and says, bury me at this spot, for I've heard Patrick Henry. And they do. He's buried later at that spot at St. John's Church. So this idea that Henry really brought the revolution on, he was far before all of us, Jefferson would say, in keeping the spirit of the revolution going. And at the time, he's a hothead. I mean, the conservatives are saying, are you crazy? Why are you talking about arms? But, within weeks, you have Lexington and Concord, and suddenly Patrick Henry looks like the man who knew exactly what was going to happen.
The new book is Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution. My guest is author John Ragosta. My guest is author and historian John Ragosta. His latest book is Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution. John, let's talk about that revolution. Where was Henry during the war? Was he a soldier? Was he in the field?
No, it's that's one thing that was difficult for Henry. He's at the Second Continental Congress, which is going to give us the Declaration of Independence. But he comes back to Virginia to help write the Constitution and becomes the first governor. But he's also, before that, in 1775, when he comes back, he becomes the head of Virginia's military. The speech in March of 1775 was to create the military. He's asked to basically be in charge of Virginia's military. But the conservatives, Edmund Pendleton in particular, who is the chairman of the Committee of Safety, so the military reports to the civil government. We already had that concept going. Henry has to report to Edmund Pendleton.
And these are organized, paid soldiers. This isn't the citizens' militia that was much glorified and led to the Second Amendment. And this is a different thing. This is a real army.
Right. They're starting to... Now, it's Virginia's army. And they're going to be subsumed later in the Continental Army. But Henry, in theory, is put in charge of this because he's the most popular politician in Virginia. So they make him head of the Virginia's army. Washington's already heading off north, but Henry's going to be head of the army. But Pendleton, who's the chairman of the Committee of Safety, is very concerned. Henry's too popular, and you don't want someone that popular running the military.
Yes, they were all students of Roman history. They knew.
they know what can happen.
Yes, indeed.
And so they really insult Henry, that they take his second in command, Woodford, and send him to do all the fighting. So down at Great Bridge, when the Lord Dunmore, Governor Dunmore, is attacking and Woodford is defending, it should have been Henry, but they wouldn't let Henry fight. And then they also told his second in command to report directly to the Committee of Safety rather than through Henry. So they really basically tried to freeze him out of a military position because they were afraid. And he had no military experience, unlike George Washington, who had experience from the French and Indian War. So Washington says, Henry resigns, sort of in a tiff. A lot of the men threaten to resign with Henry because they feel the common soldier feels that this is bad. And Henry actually goes to the soldiers and begs them not to resign. He says, this is more important than one man. I feel I need to resign, but you need to stick with the army. You need to support the common cause.
It's almost like that Washington moment in Newburgh, the Newburgh conspiracy, where a leader addresses his troops, very emotional, and just makes all the troops love him even more.
Right, and they stay. Most of the soldiers stay. And Washington then later says, Washington and Henry had a very good relationship. And Washington says, really, it's better for Virginia for Henry to be in the Senate, so to speak. He's a better politician than a military man. So he has this very short experience as a military man, but then he becomes the first governor of Virginia for 3 years because that's the limit under the Constitution. You can only be elected 3 one-year terms. But he has an important role in those 3 years. He helps support Washington at Valley Forge. He sends George Rogers Clark out to conquer the Northwest Territories, which become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan.
And we have a big, huge statue to that man right near the UVA hospital on West Main Street. Yeah.
And had he not done that, that territory might have stayed part of Canada after the war. So he's relatively successful in his 3 terms as governor. But then Jefferson becomes the second governor, and things are less happy.
Yeah, thrown into stark relief when compared to Patrick Henry, just as Jefferson was in stark relief compared to Benjamin Franklin when he went to Paris. He was sort of always following up some...
Right, and it's hard to follow Patrick Henry. Henry is beloved. He's the most popular politician in Virginia. He's been very successful as governor. And, from Jefferson's perspective, Henry had not had to deal with a bunch of invasions of Virginia during the first 3 years, 1776 through 1779.
Which Jefferson did as governor. Yeah.
Right, and Jefferson then has to deal with these invasions.
And plus, the biggest difference, arguably, between them is Patrick Henry was very, very comfortable on his feet in front of a crowd. Jefferson never was.
Jefferson never likes that. And Henry is also much more willing to adapt to the situation. I mean, Jefferson wants to follow the rules a little bit. But Henry, as governor, for example, there's a conspiracy against George Washington, the Conway cabal, that after all, Washington has lost New York, he's lost Philadelphia, General Gates has won in Saratoga. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the Congress to maybe we should replace George Washington with General Gates and Horatio Gates. And history would have been very different had that happened. Henry gets an anonymous letter that says he's the governor of Virginia, the largest state in the country, gets an anonymous letter saying all of these things and saying, we want your support to replace Washington. Henry is appalled because he thinks George Washington is already the father of his country. He appreciates Washington's sacrifices. He sends the anonymous letter to Washington. And he says, I am embarrassed that anybody would think that they could send me a letter who's an enemy of yours. And Washington thanks him. Washington now has the letter handwriting. He figures out who it is.
Does he?
He recognizes the handwriting. And Washington is successful at avoiding the conspiracy against him. But he always credits Henry for that Henry backed him when he was governor of Virginia.
Yeah. So we fast forward through the successful revolution. Then we get up to the 1780s and this idea of a new constitution, creating a new federal government, because America won the war under a different government. The Articles of Confederation, loosely confederated states, the power was in every state capital with every state legislature, these laboratories of democracy. They're all doing things a little bit different, but then the late 1780s comes. There's Shays' Rebellion. There's talk we need a more powerful federal force. We need a federal presence.
Right, and keep in mind who is saying this. people like George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton saying we need a more powerful federal government. And it's not just Shays' Rebellion, but the country was in default on its debt. We had a big debt from the Revolutionary War, and by 1787, we're in default. We can't pay our debt because the Articles of Confederation, under which we had won the Revolution, but the national government has no authority to tax. And so the only way for them to get money is to ask the states, please send us money. You know, Virginia, you owe us $1 million. Maryland, you owe us $500,000. And
there was no way to get the money.
Yeah, and the states wouldn't do it. The states were busy with their own problems. I mean, there was a recession after the war. The economy was bad. So with the government in default, there's problems with the Native Americans out in the Northwest Territories, and there's no government really to fight them. We're having problems with our trade. So a lot of people decided we really need a much more powerful national government. And to a point, Henry agreed. To a point. He said, you know, I agree, we've got to give the government some ability to raise revenue. But he was very uncomfortable with taking power away from the states. And it was related to the same idea about the common man and democracy, that, you know, in Richmond, people can understand what's going on in Red Hill or in Norfolk or in Winchester.
Whereas Washington's not yet.
Right.
Or then New York, yeah.
It's New York at the time, but it's going to become Washington, you know, a distant government that's going to be separated.
Jefferson wrote about the same thing. The more you remove the base of power from somebody's neighborhood or their private concerns, the more likely you will have a tendency towards tyranny, because they'll abuse the power that they have.
And power corrupts. And if you create more power, there's more possibility of corruption. So Henry starts out understanding that there's a problem. We need a more powerful government. And he's elected to the Philadelphia Convention. He's one of the delegates elected by Virginia. He and George Washington are the most popular men in Virginia. He doesn't go.
That's a huge moment in Henry's story, right? What did he say? I smell a rat in Philadelphia?
Of the apocryphal stories, he said, I smelled a rat. Probably didn't say that, but certainly the concept is there. He tells the governor, Edmund Randolph, he basically says, look, I need to earn some money. I mean, I've been in government for a long time. I don't have the kind of money that Washington and Jefferson has. I have been a public servant for years. You don't need me. And
was that an excuse? Did he just not want to be a part of what was happening?
It's hard.
Was he thinking of his legacy and his reputation?
It's hard to tell. I think that he had served for many, many years. He was just coming off his 5th year as governor. His family did need him. And so I think that he could have, in his mind, believed they don't need me in Philadelphia. Now, he later regrets not having gone, because when he sees what they bring back, which is a powerful national government, he becomes the great anti-federalist. And I think somewhat reluctantly. He didn't want to take on that role. He didn't want to have to fight these people, but he viewed it as absolutely essential, because you've created a government that's too powerful, too distant, and I'm going to tell you it's going to lead to corruption.
And then he in a sense, you should join Jefferson and Madison in being the great anti-federalists of the day, as they watched arguably what happened in Egypt happened in America. The military guys took over after this populist democratic revolution, and they cracked down.
Right, but he comes at it somewhat differently than even, say, Madison and Jefferson. One of his concerns, and some of his speeches during the Ratification Convention are absolutely beautiful. And one of his complaints is people who want this government want an empire. And Jefferson talks about an empire of liberty, but he still wants an empire. He wants a powerful nation. And Henry has almost sort of a Switzerland concept, that we're going to have these independent states and you're going to have a national government, but the national government doesn't need to be big and powerful. Why? Because government is about being comfortable under your vine and fig tree and having your family and being relatively prosperous. But he didn't feel any need to sort of thump his chest and say, America's going to be the greatest nation in the whole world.
Yeah, he wasn't Hamilton.
He's not Hamilton. Or Madison and Washington are saying this at the time. They're saying, the United States is not living up to its potential. We could be a powerful empire. And that wasn't the point of the revolution. The point of the revolution was we could run our own country. And that country doesn't have to be big and powerful. So he is, in many respects, the father of what becomes the Jefferson-Madison Democratic-Republican Party, but really for slightly different reasons. And then what's fascinating, and jumping ahead a little bit, Coy, is that his final campaign in 1799, Henry's in retirement. They've offered him every position in the government. He's Supreme Court Justice. He says no. Ambassador to Spain, ambassador to France, senator, no. And he says, look, you people wanted this big national government. I told you not to do it, but it's fine. You have your government. And he says, I'll be peaceable under this government, but I'm not going to
He doesn't want to be a part of it. Yeah.
I'm not going to be a part of it. And that's fine. And he'd be much more famous had he been a Supreme Court Justice, had he been an ambassador. Well, in 1799, George Washington writes him a letter and says, January 15th, 1799, he says, you have to come out of retirement. Henry's living in retirement. He's old. He's ill.
He's living where? Where is his
He's living
home?
in Red Hill, almost to North Carolina. It's down on the border. It's an hour south of Lynchburg today. At that time, it was a week south of Lynchburg.
Yeah.
And Washington writes him and says, you have to come out of retirement because these people are going to destroy the country that we built. And they're tearing apart the government.
These people, Jefferson and Madison.
It's Jefferson and Madison.
Yeah.
He never says that in the letter. Here's George Washington writing Patrick Henry saying, you have to come out of government to save the nation because Jefferson and Madison are going to destroy the country.
I always find it so endearing, I guess, in a way that so many Americans today don't really appreciate the extent to which the political factions of our day existed then, and that Jefferson and Madison were not on the same side. I mean, Jefferson and Washington were on different sides of the aisle.
And by this point, it didn't start that way, but by 1799, absolutely. And Washington is saying, look, what Jefferson and Madison's radical states' rights views, where Jefferson's talking about states can nullify federal action. So if the federal government does something that's unconstitutional, the state can just ignore it. They don't have to enforce those laws. That's going to destroy the nation, Washington's saying to Henry. Henry writes back and says, I agree completely. I'll run for the Virginia Assembly. He said, I can't run for Congress. I'm old and I'm ill. And he gives a speech at Charlotte Courthouse, and he's elected. And his speech at the Charlotte Courthouse, I think, is his real legacy and what's really important. He says, look, I warned you, talking to the people. He said, I warned you what was going to happen with this Constitution. I told you the government was going to be too powerful. I told you that they would abuse power and adopt things like the Alien and Sedition Act. But the way to deal with that is at the ballot box. Virginia has no more right to ignore the federal government than Charlotte County has a right to ignore Virginia. You adopted this Constitution. If you don't like it, you elect congressmen and you change it, but you don't ignore it. And he says, and again, wonderful Henry speech, and this one's very well recorded. He says at some point, if you go this route that Madison and Jefferson are pushing you, Washington is going to invade Virginia at the head of a federal army. And who would dare take up arms against George Washington? And of course, there's a drunk in the audience, because there's always a drunk in the audience in Virginia election. And some drunk says, I would fight Washington. Well, Henry rises up and he says, you dare not do it. In such a parricidal attempt, the steel would drop from your nerveless arm. And people are shocked. So here's Patrick Henry. So this 1799 election, though, is really, and it has a message, I think, very important for us today, that, look, opposition to the government is one thing. I opposed this Constitution, Patrick Henry, but it was adopted, and you have to follow the law. In the Revolution, that was different. We didn't have representatives. We didn't have a vote. We had armies and navies coming in and invading us from a government in which we had no representative. But now, under the Constitution, if you don't like it,
you have the power to vote out all of them if you want to.
Vote them out if you want to vote them out, but you don't take up arms. And there was real concern. Alexander Hamilton was concerned that there was going to be a military conflict. There were rumors by 1800 that James Monroe, who was the newly elected governor of Virginia, was stockpiling arms for what might happen vis-a-vis the federal government. So Henry wasn't making this up. And we see people today talking about, the federal government's out of control. Patrick Henry had the right idea, liberty, states' rights. and talking about taking up arms.
But they don't know Henry.
They don't know Henry.
They don't really know the history.
They don't understand.
And I would ask you that, but with the time we have left, the legacy of Henry today, that the Clive Bundy, we were talking during the break, the Clive Bundys of the world out there, the guys who want to grab their gun and take on the federal government, and they're always quoting Patrick Henry, but they're wrong. They're just wrong.
They're wrong. They don't understand what Henry is saying, that Henry was fighting when there was no representation. Once there's representation, and he says at this speech at Charlotte Courthouse, he says, if you cannot solve your problems, if there is no way to vote, and that's not true in America. It's true for African Americans in America at the time. It's true for women at the time. But he said, if you can't use democracy to solve your problems, he said, yes, you have a right to depose of a government, but if you ever depose of this government under the Constitution, you're going to have a monarchy or a dictatorship. That's what's going to happen. So I think he does speak to us today, but it's a message that people sometimes don't want to hear. Yes, we're in favor of liberty. Yes, we're in favor of people's rights, but you do it under the law.
John Ragosta, his new book is Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution. When do we get the Hollywood movie? Has there ever been?
We need a rap movie. We need a rap. Broadway show about Patrick Henry.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Speaking about not understanding the past, what's been your reaction to that? Because to me, Alexander Hamilton was everything that was wrong with the 1790s, and maybe I'm too much of a Jeffersonian, but he is. I've been very shocked to see him glorified in the 21st century in Broadway.
Well, I'll say this, because Jefferson ends up hating Patrick Henry and hating Alexander Hamilton, but differently. And to give Hamilton credit, Jefferson dislikes Hamilton because he disagrees with him. He disagrees with his politics. But he ultimately decides that, Hamilton was in his own way trying to do what was right for the government. And Jefferson in his first inauguration says, we may disagree in actions, but not principle. And We're still all Americans. Very much a Henry message. Henry in 1774, I'm not a Virginian, I'm an American. Jefferson hates Patrick Henry because he thinks Patrick Henry personally insulted him. And Jefferson really is a Virginia gentleman, and his honor was insulted by Patrick Henry. So
in what way? By opposing?
No, that after Jefferson's failed governorship, when he runs, when Charlottesville is invaded, the legislature launches an investigation of Jefferson, basically accusing him of cowardice. Jefferson blamed Henry for that investigation.
And that haunted Jefferson his whole life.
For his whole life. He says,
when he did nothing that anybody wouldn't do. The troops are coming in Charlottesville. He got his family out of there. He jumped on his horse and he went away.
And Jefferson says, this will only be healed by the all-healing grave. He was really hurt. And he was especially hurt that Patrick Henry, who he had idolized, was behind it. He thinks. Now, historians disagree. I think Jefferson was right. Henry had his fingers in it. Yeah.
Really? And what's the motivation of Henry? Why would he want to hurt Jefferson's legacy and reputation?
They later take it back. They later cancel the after Yorktown. They withdraw the investigation. Henry had just been governor for 3 years. He knew it was hard to be governor. He knew that there were problems, but he never failed quite the way Jefferson did. And I just think it was a mistake. I think Henry would say it was a mistake, but I think he was reacting. They were in Stanton. They were afraid that the redcoats were coming. Jefferson had fled to Poplar Forest.
And they were looking for a fall guy.
They were looking for a fall guy.
For that invasion that got all the way up to Charlottesville.
Yeah. So, I think it was a mistake, but Jefferson could never let it go. So anyway, back to Hamilton and the musical. Hamilton is not the bad guy, even to Jefferson at the end of the day. He's wrong, Jefferson thinks.
Oh, he's wrong.
He's wrong, yeah. But he's not the bad guy. He was trying to help his country. And one thing that we really do owe Henry is the idea of you can be a loyal opposition. Jefferson's quote from his first inaugural, that people may differ in means but not in principle. Henry had actually said that a year or two before then, and was very much of this idea that I can disagree with you strongly, but let's not forget that what makes us Americans, what unites us, this is also a message for today. What unites us is more important than what divides us.
Right.
What makes the country great is more important than the problems we have.
And that as I teach my class, that it's the divide that unites us, because that divide has always been there since even before the Revolution.
Right.
It's always been a part of who we are.
Right.
And
that's when Henry in 1799 is saying, you can fight the federal government, you can disagree with the federal government, but you don't take up arms against the federal government. And Jefferson sort of realize, Madison knows that Jefferson has gone overboard. Jefferson, when he wins in 1800, sort of realizes that there was a crisis, that they took actions that were, very, very strong. But I think both Henry and Hamilton and Jefferson, the three together, you could say, developed this notion that we can be violently disagree. Violently is the wrong term. We can strongly disagree.
Passionately
disagree. But let's not lose sight. We're Americans, and the principles that unite us, the idea of democracy, the idea of the people are going to control, the idea of freedom, the idea of
justice,
religious freedom,
opportunity,
justice,
education,
equality, these principles are really far more important than what divides us.
John Ragosta's new book is Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution. John, let's have you back on soon. We'll talk more.
Thank you,
I could talk all day. I really enjoy it. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.